late July 144 AD. The clergy of the Christian community at Rome is holding a hearing. A very distinguished member of the congregation named Marcion stands before the presbyteries to present to them his teaching of the gospel, with the purpose of convincing the elders. But what he now presented to the presbyters was so outrageous that it left his listeners speechless. The event ended with a strident rejection of Marcion's views. He was formally excommunicated. This is how Bruce M. Metzger describes what happened in his book, The Canon of the New Testament. Jehovah's Witnesses, or former Jehovah's Witnesses, may be reminded of their committees, the disfellowshipping, and the shunning of such an apostate. But there are many differences. One in particular, and let's listen what Bruce Metzger writes. He had been a member of one of the Roman churches for a number of years and had demonstrated his orthodoxy by substantial financial contributions. No doubt he was a respected church member, but then he was formally excommunicated and his monetary contributions were returned to him. This has probably never been experienced by any Jehovah's Witnesses or ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. We would certainly have been happy to have our donations refunded when we officially left the religious community of Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany. But that is another topic. Today we want to talk about the doctrine of this man of Marcion. What doctrine then did Marcion present that provoked such a reaction? Marcion, as we know, wrote only one work, the Antithesis. It has not survived to us, which is only too understandable in the case of a book so dangerous to the church. We do know, however, that for a long time these thoughts were one of the strongest movements in Christianity and were fiercely opposed. Tertullian, for example, wrote 5 books against Marcion, and this was already his second, more detailed work. So it seems that there was something to Marcion's teaching, doctrine, if such an effort was necessary to prove that it was heretical. Or maybe we should better say, not orthodox. Thus, if the rebuttals are already so extensive, it is not possible to explain the doctrine adequately in a few sentences. Whoever wants to know more is referred, for example, to one monumental work, this one, 640 pages of the German scholar Adolf von Harnack, Marcion, das Evangelium vom fremden Gott. In English, Marcion, the Gospel of the unknown God, the foreigner. And yes, it's a reprint of a book which is 100 years old in German. You can also read a more recent book from more recent times by Barbara Aland, Was ist Gnosis? What is Gnosis? Perhaps it's also translated in English. You will find resources in the internet. However, since we do not primarily want to analyze his teaching itself, but what impact he had on the canon of the New Testament, we will start with a few statements by Paul, the Apostle Paul. And you can read it also with me here. Basically, you see here, I will quote Galatians 1 and 2, and then finally Romans. And you may well know these sentences. So these are statements by Paul. Paul, an apostle, not sent from men, nor through human agency, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. But when he who had set me apart, even from my mother's womb, called me through his grace, was pleased. Interesting. Next quote. For I would have you know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel which was preached by me is not of human invention. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. And then he said, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. But I went away to Arabia and returned once more to Damascus. But from those who were of considerable repute, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no favoritism. Well, those who were of repute contributed nothing to me. Or you can translate, gave me nothing new. But on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. For he who was at work for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised was at work for me also to the Gentiles. And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas, so Petrus, and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. And now something about Paul's teachings. Why the law then? So the Jewish law. It was added on account of the violations, having been ordered through angels at the hand of a mediator, until the seed would come, to whom the promise had been made. You have been severed from Christ. You who are seeking to be justified by the law, you have fallen from grace. Or final one. So then, as through one offense the result was condemnation to all mankind, so also through one act of righteousness the result was justification of life to all mankind. What beliefs does Paul convey here about himself and the gospel? Let's summarize and repeat, because we will compare then to what Marcion taught. Paul said that Paul became an apostle directly from Jesus himself and God the Father. The apostles were chosen by Jesus. He was even chosen by God in his mother's womb. So none of the apostles can say that about themselves, and never did. He received the gospel by revelation from Jesus Christ. He does not mention any gospels or a report of the other apostles as a source. On the contrary, he did not consider it necessary to consult the apostles appointed before him in Jerusalem, as if it were only advice of men, of humans. The respected ones, whose reputation he considers unimportant, the apostles and elders, the pillars, as he said, so-called pillars of the church in Jerusalem, had nothing new for him. He was entrusted with the Gospels for the Gentiles, and they agreed with that. Paul even had to confront Peter publicly. The law is here to make sin and transgression visible. The contrast to this is the grace through Christ. At least that is how it can be interpreted, what Paul said or wrote. And life comes only through the sacrificial death of Jesus. Let us compare this with essential elements of Marcion's thoughts and teachings, as far as they can be reconstructed from the writings of his opponents. And I simplify here, but otherwise it would be a long video. It will be a longer video, but it would be a very long video. So Marcion taught Paul is the only true apostle, because only he truly understood the gospel. And compare that with Paul's own words that he received the gospel from Christ directly. The other apostles, that was another teaching, fell back into the old Jewish thinking or never fully understood the true gospel. Also, Paul said they had nothing new from him and it was just humans and he didn't consult them. The Old Testament, with the law and its just punishing God, and its just punishing God stands in contrast to the loving God and Jesus Christ and their redemption through grace. Therefore, the Old Testament is no longer important for the believers, but only the gospel. So that's just a few things of Marcion's teachings and doctrines. The importance of Paul as an apostle and the gospel as he preached it is not only emphasized but consistently developed, in some cases even radically developed. But it is interesting that many Christians today think pretty much the same way, isn't it? You just have to believe in Jesus and then you're saved. Jesus loves you. Love is the most important thing. The Old Testament is not that important to us today. Although the church bitterly fought Marcion and his movement, it seems that to me that today quite a few are again some kind of Marcionists and think pretty similar to what he said, to some of its teachings at least. However, I have not yet mentioned a central point in Marcion's theology. Here he develops Pauline thoughts to the last consequence. If there is such a difference between the Mosaic law and the love of Christ, if the God of the Old Testament is just but also cruel, but in the Gospel is described as God of love, who is completely love, then Yahweh, YHWH, from YHWH, from the Jewish Bible, and the God of the Gospel cannot be the same. That was his conclusion. It must be a God unknown to us so far. And that's the reason for the book, The Gospel of the Unknown God. The God of the Old Testament, of the Jewish Bible, the creator God of this sinful, unjust world, he called him the demiurge, from ancient Greek, the word which means create. He who in the Jewish Bible calls himself Yahweh is the lower God of the law, the punishing one. A law that existed only to show faultiness and sin of man and creation. Therefore, we did not know the highest God at all until now. He is a God full of love and goodness, and he sent Jesus as his messenger. He is the Redeemer God, who is far above the evil Creator God of the law. The Creator God condemns us to death. The Redeemer God gives us life. Probably we have to listen very carefully, because sometimes you think, oh yeah, that's right, and then no, or is it right or not? So it's interesting. That's Paul's thoughts to a very extreme, but to the final consequence. Still, we may not be comfortable with the separation into two deities. But isn't this how many people distinguish the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, even today? So even today, many see a contrast here and solve it in a surprisingly similar way. And in fact, many theological concepts of Marcion were later incorporated into the teachings of the Church. Let us not forget that after this excommunication, many churches joined his teachings and became one of the most important movements of Christianity. Considering that the disputes on the subject of the law were already current at the time of Paul, and the relationship of Jesus' disciples to Judaism was constantly developing, he might have gotten away with his theology quite for a while. I'm speculating now, but that would have been possible. But one thing was a logical consequence for him, which was certainly decisive. The messenger of the Redeemer God was good through and through and full of love, and therefore could only be divine. He could have nothing human about him, because humans are part of the creation and therefore the imperfect world of the other God, the demiurge. Humans cannot free themselves from evil and the law by themselves. Therefore, it only appeared as if the Son of God had become a man, a human. He was also not the Messiah foretold in the Old Testament. This teaching, of course, was the terrible heresy of Docetism, which was fought just as vehemently by the Church. This was already recorded between the 1st and the 2nd century, and you may know this verse. It's 2 John chapter 1 verse 7. I say this because many deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh, as a human, have gone out into the world. Any such person is the deceiver and the Antichrist. So the problem with the nature of Jesus Christ, as we have already seen, has occupied many, and only one of several movements has survived. So this was a hot topic at that time in those centuries. And Marcion's conclusion was in one direction, but what became the church later, the orthodox views of the church, they were in an opposite direction. So Marcion's work, however, although it was not then the main movement later on, had another very interesting influence. And the question is, how did Marcion influence the development of the canon of the New Testament? Marcion was convinced that only Paul had received the real gospel directly from God and Christ, which Paul said, and that the other apostles had not understood it and had even mixed it with thoughts from the Jewish Bible. Hearing Paul say this in Galatians and other letters, it does not sound so different. In fact, however, Paul's letter and his theology were not at all as determinative in parts of the church as they still were in the middle of the 1st century. Marcion therefore wanted to restore the true gospel. Even in his time, there were already different gospels, with different representations and different copies and traditions, not to mention the Apocrypha. He therefore chose Luke's gospel as the only true one and purged it of errors. We had also seen in this series many examples of copies deliberately changing the text to support or prevent a particular teaching. Marcion felt that even writings of Paul were so corrupted already, and set up a collection of corrected writings. Therefore, important scholars believe that it was Marcion. Marcion was thus the first to establish a canon of the Christian writings, the one who was a heretic and excommunicated. This heretic, of all people, he most probably did the first canon. In fact, his work definitely helped to accelerate the development of the canon of the New Testament as we know it today. In summary, therefore, I would like to quote from Adolf von Harnack's work, which is in Germany, but I translate it. And if you don't know it, if you find the word here, soteriology is the doctrine of man's redemption in the Christian context. I hope this translation is somewhat okay, because the original text is written in a complex German of the 19th century. So even for Germans, it's not easy to understand. Let's try, and you can read it with me. And if you want to have a look, that's the reprint here of the digitalized version of the printing of the 1920s. So let's start here. And Adolf von Harnack summarizes the importance and influence of Marcion, not only by the fact that all these pieces appear earlier in Marcion than in the Great Church. The causal priority of this single man is proved, but even more surely by the observations, see the supplements, how strongly the Marcionite Bible as such, and also through its text, has influenced the Catholic one. Above all, the powerful penetration of the Marcionite prologues to the Pauline epistles into the Latin Bible of the Church speaks the most eloquent language here. So Marcion did not just collect Paul's writing and Luke as the Gospel and cleaned those, but he wrote also prologues. And interestingly, these prologues were then, although he was excommunicated, in the Latin Bible. So von Harnack wrote, how often must the Marcionite collection of letters have come into the hands of Catholics and remained unrecognized at first? For decades, copies of Paul's letters were missing in the Catholic churches. But also the obvious fact that Irenaeus, the founder of the soteriological church doctrine, as well as Tertullian and Origenes, developed their biblical doctrines about goodness and justice, about gospel and law, about the Creator God and the Redeemer God, etc., in the struggle against Marcion, and learned from him in the process, that is of highest importance. Finally, through Marcion, also for the great church, Paul has been reawakened from, e.g., a teacher like Justin had already completely pushed aside, and the Roman Christian Hermas had completely ignored Paul. Above all, however, the position of the great Christianity towards the Old Testament has become a considerably different one than before as a result of the confrontation with Marcion. Before, the danger was burning that one recognized the Old Testament as the Christian document, partly explained literally, partly allegorically, and was content with it. Now, although this danger was still not finally eliminated, and a satisfactory clarity was not established, the judgment that in the Old Testament the ore still lies in the pits, and that it is the legislatio in servitutem, as opposed to the New Testament legislatio in libertatem, nevertheless created room and prestige for itself. Yes, we now hear statements about the Old Testament from outstanding church scholars that go even beyond Paul. The church owes this to Marcion. If one adds that only after Marcion, the purposeful work began in the great Christianity to bring about the Holy Church, the bride of Christ, the spiritual Eve, the aeon beyond from heaven, and to unite the congregations on earth to an actual community and unity on the basis of a firm doctrine rooted in the New Testament, as Marcion did. Then it is proven that Marcion gave the decisive impulse for the creation of the old Catholic Church by his organizational and theological conceptions, and by his work, and provided the model. He is also credited with having first conceived and first realized the idea of a canonical collection of Christian writings, the New Testament. Finally, he was also the first in the Church to make Paul's soteriology the center of doctrine, while the ecclesiastical apologists beside him based Christian doctrine on cosmology. So, even with these few sentences, we see that Marcion, although excommunicated, did a lot related to church doctrines, church organization, and, interesting for us, the canon of the New Testament. And he probably created the first New Testament canon for us. I said he was one of the largest movement, or his successors then created one of the largest movements in Christianity in the first centuries. What were the movements among the Christ disciples? Do we know others? So, having recognized that even the Christian movement that did not survive had an influence on the scriptures and the canon, the question arises whether there were others like it. So, first of all, Jesus and the disciples lived in Judaism during the Second Temple period. At that time, there were the movements of the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, and others. The disciples came from or were close to these groups, probably except for the Sadducees, the priestly aristocratic upper class. Paul had been a Pharisee, and Simon the Zealot, as the name says, may have been or be close to the Zealots. But the influence of the Essenes, who were expecting the Messiah, should not be ignored either. It is interesting to note that of these, essentially only the Pharisees as a group survived after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Then the Gentiles, people who were not Jews, also came. And some of them were also so-called God-fearers, i.e. Gentiles who already sympathized with Judaism. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem 70 AD was of course a drastic event. Essentially, the movements among the Christians can then, after that, be divided into three main directions. And we see these three ones. They were Jewish Christians, for example, the Nazarene, and here's the link in Wikipedia. They continued to consider keeping the law important and saw Jesus as a prophet. Unlike the Ebionites, however, they accepted the virgin birth. In the patronistic period and the church fathers, they were known and their point of view was discussed. The Ebionites, whether they gave themselves this designation, which means the poor, is unknown. But they tried, like Jesus' first disciples, to give up everything. For them to be a disciple of Jesus, one had to be a Jew in any case. For them, Christ did not live before he lived on earth. He was only a man whom God adopted. We had this already. Adopted and gave a special position because of his righteousness. They also rejected Paul's theology. Therefore, the pre-Orthodox Christians, they were heretics who had to be fought for them. That is why especially the position that Jesus was only a man was fought. As we have seen, that is why they sometimes changed the text of the scriptures, because of this belief. Then the main movement, the direction, were the Pauline Christians. Christians whose theology was based on the writings and teachings of Paul. And it would be interesting to have a closer look. What's the difference between what Paul said, which we don't find in the Gospels, for example? And then there were Gnostic Christians. And this was not a unified or unique group, but there were many different directions. For them, the material world was fundamentally bad. Sounds familiar. And all what mattered was a spiritual world. Well, there seems to be some of this idea left. The Gnostic groups thought that they possessed gnosis, knowledge, the secret knowledge of the spiritual world and its way as the key to salvation. And we should keep in mind that between 180 and 313 AD, the Great Church prevailed, which further developed Paul's theology and contradicted all others in their writings. As a result, their points of view, all the other points of views or arguments to the contrary, entered into the texts and teachings of the church. In a way, a creed was formed which defended itself against all the other ideas. 313 AD is an important date because there, in the Edict of Milan, Milan, Christians were granted legal status throughout the Roman Empire. And then, a few days later, in 325, the Emperor Constantine converted, we can discuss that, but converted then the Christian religion, and the first Council of Nicaea took place. There, a uniform confession of faith was to be created, which was then finally the Confession of Nicaea, so the Nicene Creed. However, the claimed substantiality of God the Father and God the Son was still rejected by many. Arius and his followers were called the Arians. And the dispute with this group shaped not only the creed, but also the selection of writings for the canon and sometimes the text itself. Let us only think back to the Comma Johanneum comma, or the other modified texts. When the leading movement which stood behind the Confession of Nicaea then became the state religion of Emperor Theodosius in 380 AD, it finally prevailed. So these examples may suffice to show that the selection of writings, the development of the canon, and the writings themselves were not implemented in a straight line according to a plan step by step, but emerged over centuries, and that the influence of the other movements in Christianity, which have disappeared later on, should not have been overlooked, especially Marcion and his movement. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video, in the next part of the series. Goodbye.